Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for standing by. Welcome to the EFA live webinar conference call. All participants are in a listening mode. There'll be a presentation followed by a question and answer session, at which time if you'd like to ask a question, you'll need to press star 1 on your telephone. If you require technical assistance at any time, please press star 0. I must advise you that this conference is being recorded today, on Monday the 2nd of December 2013. I'd now like to hand the conference over to your speaker today, Brendan Barnes. Please go ahead, sir.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for joining the webinar this evening. I'm sorry we've made it so late in the day. To give you a bit of background, in July this year, EFPIA and pharma member companies launched a set of commitments around data sharing, and we thought it would be opportune at this point to sort of, if you like, a sort of an update, a briefing on where people have got to, because the commitments come into effect 1st of January next year. So I think the companies set themselves a very ambitious, challenging target, and we thought it'd be useful to see what progress has been made. Since July, from the EFPIA point of view, we've been talking to people about these commitments, and as well as hearing tonight about what the companies have planned, we'll also give us a chance to get some feedback on what we've heard from people in the sort of the events and the surveys that we've organised. So just to run through the plan for the day or for the evening, kicking off with setting the scene, I'm then going to hand over to Faraz Kamani, who will moderate the whole session. We have a session led by Dwayne Schultes, who will brief you on a survey on data sharing that he ran for us earlier this year. Then Ingrid Klingman is going to talk about the results of a workshop we ran with a number of other stakeholders in October. And then finally, we hope we will have 3 inputs from companies who are busy implementing commitments. And at that point, I think I will wrap up, which has the added advantage that it gets us back to being within 2 minutes of being on time. And I will hand over to Dwayne to take things forward. Okay, thank you very much for joining us.
I think you mean Faraz.
I beg pardon, to Faraz.
Thank you.
I beg your pardon, Faraz, to you.
Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar. At present, I haven't got complete contact with the webinar itself, but I think we should start anyway. I think we'll begin with Dwayne Schultes. He's Managing Director of Vital Transformations, and he's going to make a presentation concerning survey results. He'll be followed by Ingrid Klingman, Chair of the European Forum for Good Clinical Practice, and the title of her presentation will be How to Progress Data Sharing. Both presenters have time limits, after which we will have rough 5 to 10 minutes of questions. So, Dwayne, if I can invite you to go forth.
Thank you, Faraz. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. You can probably see the first slide. Some of this may look very familiar to you. This is the publicity that we ran on August 27th for the data sharing event. The reason why I was asked to do a survey is, and I'm not sure if everybody who's been in the loop since these discussions on August 27th is aware of this, but the final report that we collated and circulated, the report on the clinical trial data sharing event on August 27th has, as of today, downloaded 3,800 copies. It's been amazing the amount of interest in this issue. Obviously, it's an extremely important, vital, and controversial issue, at least it has been. So we decided in consultation with EFPIA that it would be a good idea to launch a more comprehensive survey to get stakeholder feedback, and that's precisely what we have done. So after the event in August, we launched the stakeholder survey, which was conducted from October 4th through October 21st. It was conducted on behalf of EFPIA, run by VitalTransformation.com. We sent the survey to a population of a little bit over 4,200 people. That would be our population. And we had, quite good response rates. We had 236 responses in general, and then of that, 217 completed all questions fully. So that's the data set which we are utilizing now to derive our information. Given those numbers, we end up with a margin of error of 6.5% plus or minus on a confidence interval of 95%. So this is a pretty good, I think, indication of general stakeholder belief and feeling on the issue. So who answered the survey? This is an overall demographic representation. About 30%, a little over 30% were research, and that's academic and public. About a quarter were policy communications. Now, we are assuming when we say policy and communications that the majority of those are for-profit, but it's also possible that there's a little bleed in there in the nonprofit community, but we'll assume that the majority of those are for-profit. There are other answers which are scattered, which are marginal, so it's not really worthwhile to break that up. And then we have regulators, about 10%, research private, NGOs, IP, etc. So fairly good cross-section, I think. Very good response rates in the main stakeholders, and in general, I think that this survey is quite representative. So the first question we asked was regarding patient-level data, raw data, and if that should be made available to the public. And as you can see, overwhelmingly 70% said no. We then asked that full clinical study reports submitted to regulators should be made available. And we see here 60%. And this is roughly outlining the second commitment of EFPIA and PhRMA. So we see that, again, there is a belief that clinical study reports, CSRs, should be made available. We believe that pharmaceutical companies can manage the clinical trial data disclosure process. And again, I think this question in particular, I was quite surprised given the heat that this issue has generated. Pharma actually did quite well here. I was quite surprised at the level of traction. And we decided later, and I'll go through this data to see, and I'll walk you through this, we did a control and an ANOVA analysis to determine how much of this was driven by pharma and to see if the sample was biased. And we've determined that it wasn't. I'll walk you through that later. I think clinical trial data should only be made available to qualified researchers. And again, an overwhelming 60% said yes. So what we see here is that there's a belief that data should be shared, it should be controlled, and it should be made available to qualified people. That's the general feeling. I believe that making clinical trial data publicly available could make people less willing to participate in drug trials. Again, overwhelming no. Generally, people believe that people understand the situation when they take part in a clinical trial, and data sharing is seen as part of the process. So there's a general feeling that no, this will not impede the general clinical trial process. Now, we asked some more qualitative questions here, and we asked people to say on a scale of 1 to 5 on trust, who do you trust with the following organizations to manage personal clinical trial data? Now, what's intriguing here, and I'll click through it a little bit, essentially what you see is within the margin of error, 4 of the 5 groups are extremely close. Even pharma, quite surprisingly, did better than I would have anticipated. The mode answer for both governments, research universities, nonprofit research, and pharmaceutical industry were, well, in the first 3 it was a 4, so the most common answer was a 4. Pharmaceutical industry was a dead heat between 3 and 4. Private insurance scored a 1 in the mode. So we see that, roughly 70% of all answers for private insurance were 1. So you see really insurance is not part of the discussion in this case, but I would say that if we're trying to come to a solution here, any decision that doesn't take into account the opinions of these 4 key stakeholder groups who use data will be extremely problematic. And I think this is part of the reason these solutions and discussions have been so fraught with peril, is because a lot of people here within the margin of error have a buy-in to the system and have a buy-in to the process. So anything that excludes a group will be very controversial, and because people feel that they've bought in and they have a reason to participate. Now, I mentioned earlier I wanted to do a control to see if the sample was biased based on the population. So we did 2 controls, one for policy comms, where we assume a vast majority is industry, and we did another for industry research. Again, that is obviously industry. And we decided rather than we had a couple options. We could have done a Pearson correlation, which is a binary matrix but instead I decided that we do an ANOVA analysis, which is a hypothesis test. And what we do see from the ANOVA, which is the p-value below, that yes, the two populations are segmented. In other words, we have to reject the null hypothesis. There is something going on statistically. In other words, we can't say that these populations are similar in their opinions. But that being said, we are within a margin of error of 6%, and you can see that we're only talking a 2% change in the result when it comes to policy comms, and we're only talking, a marginal change in the overall mean, which was 3.04 to 3.0. So again, because the industry research is only 7% of the population, it's a rather de minimis impact. So those were the results of the survey. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than inclined to take them right now. Thank you.
Thank you. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question today, please press *1 on your telephone and wait for your name to be announced. If you wish to cancel your request, please press the hash key. Once again, that's *1 if you'd like to ask a question.
I'd just like to say at the moment that I'm not quite connected to the web program. So if there are any verbal questions, could you please communicate them to the telephone?
Once again, that's *1 if you'd like to ask a question over the telephones.
Okay.
There appear to be no questions at this time. Sorry, one question's just come through from Ian Schofield. Please ask your question.
Yes, I just got one question. This is Ian Schofield from Scrip Intelligence here. It was just one of the questions in the survey asked whether raw data should be made available to the public. As far as I know, that's not actually being proposed. I think raw data would only be provided to researchers by way of a binding research agreement. Is that not the case?
Raw data was not part of the commitment, that's correct, but it was decided that we would ask it just to see what people's opinions were. That's correct.
All right. It's just that because that's not actually being proposed by the regulators either. I just wondered why that particular question was asked.
Because it was determined by a lot of stakeholder groups that it should be put in the survey. We inquired not only with industry, but also patient groups and other groups, and there was a general feeling that it would be good to see what people's opinions were on that versus the information that was in the commitments. It was just to see how that contrasted.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. I can see no further questions, so I'd like to pose one myself. Dwayne, it's interesting to see that in terms of who the respondents trust, you've got governments coming out fairly well, but the pharmaceutical industry has not fared badly either. Do you think these responses heavily influenced by the fact that there were many industry participants in the survey, or is pharma really winning back trust?
It's a good question, and I tried to address that in that final slide where we controlled for industry responses. We filtered out industry responses in the data set, and we also ran a hypothesis test. And I feel in the case of this study, the potential impact of industry was only 2% on the response of the mean. So in this case, I think the survey is not biased. I think just generally, the issue has been such a hot topic. I mean, when we did an event in August in Brussels, I mean, we were oversold and overbooked. Everyone wanted to be at it. It is an issue of great import to many key stakeholder groups. And I think in the flurry and in the dust and smoke of the issue, we sort of lose fact that pharma does handle clinical trial data on a regular basis every day. And I think that it's easy for us to lose sight of the fact that pharma has been trusted with data. I think what's more shocking to me is how bad insurance does, frankly. I mean, if I was APG right now, I would be trying to do everything possible in the Netherlands to try and find a common ground and get into the debate, because obviously that's going to be a serious issue, and they do control a huge part of the stakeholder population, and I think that's a large issue. And again, government does great in Europe. It'd be very interesting to run this survey in the U.S. right now on the back end of Obamacare and see where that's going. I think you might see very different responses geographically segmented. Obviously, and I should also stress this, about 96% of our responders were European-based, so this is very much a European-centric survey. I think that is borne out by the data. I
wonder also whether those results would be different if you did it in the EU on a member state by member state basis.
Oh, certainly in local language it potentially could be, yes. But again, I think going back to the first slide, we had a good cross-section of various stakeholder groups. So I'm comfortable that this survey is not biased. I'm very confident and comfortable with the results, and the consistency across all the stakeholder groups and the answers, even from industry, is quite ubiquitous and surprising. I don't think it's a surprise that industry researchers, which represented 7% of the population, were so bullish on industry's ability to handle data, but still that was only a 3.8. So we're only talking 7 percentage points, almost within the statistical margin of error from the rest of the populations, which is why it didn't bias the results.
Right, okay. Right, thank you, Dwayne, for your presentation. If we could now move on to Ingrid.
Okay,
Ingrid will be speaking on how to progress data sharing.
Yeah, I have a bit of a handicap because I can't see the screen, so I hope that we are always going to be on the same page. So the title page is How to Progress Data Sharing. Please, next slide. This was a workshop, in fact, a roundtable meeting that we had with different stakeholders. EFGCP is a not-for-profit organization that tries to facilitate communication between different stakeholders in all aspects of clinical trials, GCP, quality, ethical aspects in clinical trials, and raising issues that are especially burning, and then trying to find ways between the different stakeholders to find common ground and to potentially come to common proposals or even solutions. Next slide, please. What I'd like to present here now is the workshop and its aim. Then I would like to present the different stakeholders' considerations. Then I will report from the discussions that we had, and then present some conclusions and recommendations. Next slide, please. So workshop and its aim were twofold. At one, we wanted to identify areas of common ground for transparency rules and processes between the stakeholders, and also at working out of possible recommendations to the triage. And triage, as you probably all know, is the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council. All three bodies are now involved in finding a common denominator for the different topics and elements in the clinical trials regulation. They all need to agree and make that common document, prepare this common document. Next slide, please. We had different stakeholders in the room, and some principal statements were made at the beginning. For example, transparency is a vital part of clinical research, and it's clear that this has to be enabled because the new clinical trials regulation is going to give us the future for the next 10 years, probably, at least, and that means we have to find situations and rules that are acceptable for everybody in the longer period ahead of us. Public and private sponsors, as well as regulatory authorities, possess a large quantity of data, and we have tried very much in this workshop, in this roundtable discussion, to balance very well the situation of the pharma industry sponsors and of the academic sponsors. In both areas, we have large quantities of data, but also, of course, the regulatory authorities have that. Public scrutiny of study evaluation and result presentation can certainly support public trust in clinical research, something that we absolutely need. There is quite a lot of doubt in what we are doing on the private and on the public side, so we need to establish more trust than we have at the moment, and so providing results and reliably providing results is certainly very important here. It was also stated that the degree of transparency of clinical trial results and data, as well as the process and time point of data sharing, are under discussion. amongst the different parties involved, and that was the key topic, in fact, for this whole day of discussions. Now, as you all know, the European Commission's draft regulation foresees next slide. The European Commission's draft regulation foresees the publication of all relevant study information in a publicly accessible database. And it's mentioned there that this will include a summary of study results within 1 year after end of the trial. The European Parliament felt that this was not specific enough and added a quite large portion of text suggesting that publication of the clinical study report should be enabled for trials performed with the intention to achieve marketing authorization within 30 days after receipt of the marketing authorization or termination of the development. So here come a number of elements into the picture that have not been provided or brought up by the European Commission. Next slide, please. Obviously, the debate about transparency is ongoing since quite some time, and also EMA has released a draft policy on the publication and access to clinical trial data in June 2013, and as already mentioned, EFPIA has also in summer released the principles for responsible clinical trial data sharing. But we have also initiatives like all trials that require unlimited public access to all clinical trial raw data as soon as the study is completed. I think this is the extreme side. This all trial initiative is supported by the British Medical Journal, by the AIDS treatment group, and a quite large number of academic institutions. Next slide, please. And in the following, I would like to present, let's say, key topics that were raised by the different stakeholder groups during this roundtable discussion, starting with the patients. And it became quite clear that the patients consider it as to be a fundamental right to have access to high-quality information so that they can make informed decisions about their participation in clinical research, but also treatment decisions later on. Very clear that for them a lay summary is very important. Whatever the information to patients should be, it should be in a form that is concrete, targeted, reliable, with defined content and format. And what was also interesting, they requested free access to medical journals. They also mentioned that it's really important to build the trust in the patient population, and that mandatory publication of all results of all trials in a timely manner needs to be ensured by the new regulation. They also supported a controlled access to raw data for researchers, and proposed that the criteria for data sharing should be agreed with the patient population. Next slide, please. They also wanted the results of the trial that they participated in. And this was a topic that is mentioned in the draft regulation in a very general way. But what came also out in this debate was that they also would want to have the results on their own performance, their own result of treatments. And this is not reliably provided to patients at the end of the clinical trial or once the results are out there. So there is a need to figure out in future how we do that, whether this will be in form of the regulation, requested in the regulation, or whether this is going to be an obligation that sponsors should enable in future more reliably. That needs to be seen. But patients want the information on their personal treatment results in a clinical trial, and especially in blinded trials. Now, another point was that patients are owner of their data. So modern technology allows nowadays that they carry their health data with them on a chip. And they expressed that such a chip should include the results of their clinical trial participation. So that was the patient side. Now, next slide, please. The ethics committee's representatives plained and expressed that they need full information about results from earlier trials which might even include the possibility to check raw data where deemed necessary. So also ethics committees should have access to raw data when they feel that the summaries or the information that they received on earlier trials was not satisfactorily explained. They need to receive the full results of the studies they approve at the end, and medical journals was proposed should review their habit of only publishing positive results. The ethics committees felt that there is a high publication bias, and that should be principally changed so that also inconclusive or negative results find their way into the publishing scene. They proposed that there should be a publication agreement ensuring availability of all studies' results to mankind. Next slide, please. Now, the points raised by academia were that the current practice of large research institutions is making data available to other researchers upon request in form of a description of the intended research and subject to appropriate scientific review. Every large organization has their own approach here, but for them it is quite usual that there is an application, that there is discussion about what data are available, what makes sense to provide, when can it be provided, and what are the intentions of the requesting researcher, what is he going to do with that, and then it's a quite normal process in this area that both parties discuss and come to an agreement and feel mutually supported in their endeavors. Of course, evaluation is important to enhance trust and to prepare new scientific questions, so it should be enabled, and academic institutions see this and support that. But the clinical trial regulation should guarantee the principle of data sharing, but should not define the specific modalities, but that should be left really to the different research organizations. Next slide, please. The group was industry, and there it became very obvious that industry is in favor of a responsible data sharing. Sharing of patient-level data from clinical trials with approved IMPs upon request of qualified researchers was something that was broadly seen as being totally acceptable. Also, study summaries from clinical trials approved by regulators in Europe and US should be made available. The provision of study summaries to research participants was also something that was seen as being really important and should be enabled in future. And public certification and declaration of these policies by sponsors are really important. Now, there was also an encouragement of journals to publish all type of study results and not just the positive results. Next slide, please. The competent authorities were primarily represented by EMA, but also some national competent authorities, but especially EMA proposed that marketing-seeking companies should submit data that is either in a suitable format for publication or sharing, or so that commercially sensitive data are clearly identified and separated. Once a final decision is reached, data will then be made available. That was an interesting concept that was discussed in some detail, how that would practically work, but if all parties work together, that could be a very interesting way forward. Accurate data with little or no risk of patient privacy could be made available to everyone as well. That was seen as being not a problem by EMA. De-identified patient-level data could be made available under a data sharing agreement. And again, here were discussions about how this agreement and this interaction could work in practical terms. But this does not help data sharing in academic trials and clinical trials with authorized drugs, because that is not the data that EMA is having in its possession. So this would only cover a certain subsection of clinical trials and their results. Very interesting, next slide please, was also the viewpoint of the medical journals, in this case presented by the BMJ. They requested clear commitment to prospective registration of all clinical trials and summary results of all clinical trials to be reported within 1 year. They favored very much a public access to full clinical study reports and individual patient data for independent scrutiny by competent third parties who provide an adequate analysis protocol, commit to making their results public, and give full credit to the researchers responsible for the original data. So they were very much in favor of having such a structured approach to collaboration between the owner and the requester of the data and how that should work, and the competence of the third party and the assurance that afterwards the results will be made publicly available was seen as being very important. The implementation of a transparency score was proposed so that the public and investors can see what the different companies are doing concerning transparency. Next slide. So these were the principal statements and proposals from the different stakeholders, and then we had lively discussions about several aspects that were of primary concern. So, for example, where to store data. And it turned out that here the technicalities are really not trivial. Data storage, interoperability, and technicalities of the data provision and access have to be clarified. There was quite a big differences of opinion how that should be done, how that could be done, what would be the best approach to it. I think this is an area where there is still quite a lot of know-how required to make this process really work reliably functioning. But it turned also out, it became also clear that this may become quite demanding, the technicalities and the infrastructure, and that especially academic institutions and SMEs may have even more problems to adhere to these requirements and standards than large pharma companies. There was also discussion about should there be a central archive, where should it be a networked system per trial. So different options are imaginable, and this discussion showed that we are far away from a good and clear understanding of how this whole thing could work. Next, please. The next topic that we discussed was whether there is a need and how big is the need to perform high-quality secondary data analysis. It was stated quite clearly by as a common ground element that data sharing should be mandatory. And information provided with the clinical research reports should enable requesters to understand which data are available. That was the first topic that was discussed as being a problem, that the requesters have wrong expectations of what data are really available and in what format. All research organizations should have criteria-based data sharing and transparency policies, and those should be made publicly available so that all those who request information can see upfront what the respective policies are. Sharing policies and details of applications should be publicly available and transparently approved or rejected. That was an important element as well.
Could I just break in and say, can we have 2 more minutes on this, please?
Yes, I'm nearly done. So data requested should make the results of their own subsequent analysis publicly available. Next slide, please. Differences of opinions on conditions for secondary data analysis, like how to handle anonymization versus pseudonymization, how to handle updates of information in long studies, the need to demonstrate qualification of the requesting researchers, but how need for review process for a request by whom, the danger of publishing wrong results to the public, how big is that danger, and who should carry the costs of reanalysis, an interesting topic that has so far also not been discussed very broadly, and how to handle informed consent for secondary analysis. Results from clinical trials, should that only be results from industry-sponsored trial or from everybody? The release of results from failed studies should they also be released, for example, when there are methodological or technical or financial reasons? How can independence of decision-making release boards be ensured, and how to handle release of study results from clinical trials performed before 2004? Because those have not been, this has not been requested so far, but most drugs that are currently on the market have been tested before 2004. Next slide. So, conclusions. None of the stakeholders requested unlimited public access to all data. That was very interesting in our workshop.
I think we need to go to the next slide.
Okay, so we go
thank
to
you.
the
Yeah, thank you.
next slide, and then I'm done. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. In that case, we do have a question that's come in, and I'm not absolutely clear on what pieces of legislation this individual is referring to. However, I have a question which says, are those two pieces of legislation to be considered separately? I'm assuming here that we're referring to the EFPIA-PhRMA principles and the initiative that's going through Parliament and the European Medicines Agency.
These are two completely different aspects. I mean, one, the EFPIA document is a policy that describes what EFPIA companies are willing to do voluntarily concerning the transparency of clinical trial results, while the document that has been proposed by the European Commission and that is currently in the negotiation phase, in the triage, that is going to be our future law, our legislation that will rule the details of how clinical trials will be approved and supervised and performed in future.
And the European Medicines Agency's input in this?
That is also a policy that the European Medicines Agency has released, but because they got a lot of responses, a lot of different viewpoints and opinions, they have delayed the coming into force, so to say, of this policy and continue still their consensus process. So that is something that the European Medicines Agency will at some stage use as their own approach how they are going to handle the transparency of the data that they possess.
Right.
That is not yet decided when that will happen now.
Right. Are there any other questions via phone? If not, I can pose a further one.
You have sir.
Sorry, yes.
You have a question that's come through from Ian Schofield. Please ask your question.
No, I wasn't going to ask a question just there.
Mighty sir, there are no further questions at this time. Please continue.
Okay, Ingrid, if I could pose another question now. I'm looking at the idea of lay summaries for patient access, and in the back of my mind, I'm also thinking about the difficulties we've had to date with readability testing for drug labeling, pen information leaflets, etc. Has anyone decided how these lay summaries will actually be compiled?
No, I think at the moment everybody talks about it and let's say negotiates or fights whether this has to go into the legislation as a requirement or not. Probably it will, but the regulation will not go into the details of how this will look like or what content that will be, but it's just the fact that there will be a lay summary. It will be probably a matter of guidelines that will come in the context of this regulation that will describe in more detail the content and the format of these lay summaries. And I think that's the moment when very detailed discussions and negotiations will have to take place on how this will look in practical terms. And I foresee very much that patient organizations will at that stage be very much involved in the discussions and raise their voice very clearly what they would like to see.
Okay. Another question, could you perhaps expand a bit on, I don't know if the contributors to your meeting actually did expand on this, but how the transparency scoring would work?
Well, that was an idea that the BMJ brought into the debate. We did not go again in very much further in how it would look like, but it became clear that they have in mind a couple of criteria concerning reliability of publishing, time point of publishing, readability of the information, etc., that they think should be put together and be made publicly available. But also here, I think we are at the very, very beginning of a first idea.
Okay, I have something that's come in here which I'd like to read out. This is the All Trials campaign is now not requesting patient-level data to be made public, but they are asking for back registration of old trials that may never have been registered, and for the summary results of those trials to be made available for the record. Would you like to comment on that?
That was not exactly what I had understood from that organization, because everything I have received from them was very much focused on the possibility that researchers have unlimited access to raw data to be able to do reanalysis because of the, let's say, the suspicion that industry is hiding results, that industry is presenting results or evaluating results in a way that they are in favor of the new product, and that it would be very important that independent researchers do reanalysis whenever they want to check, the evaluation of the pharma companies. I think we have to understand that there is a fundamental trust issue in Europe in comparison to the US. In the US, the FDA analyzes their data, analyzes the data themselves. While in Europe, the political decision was made that EMA or the competent authorities are not re-evaluate or reanalyzing the data. They trust the sponsor. And I think here we have the suspicion of some academic, quite a number of academic groups, that this is not reliably working. And therefore, I think this all-trial initiative is making such a lot of pressure on getting access to possibilities to re-evaluate data themselves.
Okay. If there are no more questions, thank you, Ingrid. And I'd like to move on, please, now to company presentations from 3 EFPIA members concerning clinical trial data sharing under the EFPIA-PhRMA joint principles. Presenting will be Ivan Chan, Executive Director for Biostatistics for MSD, Duncan McHale, Vice President and Head of Global Exploratory Development at UCB, and Sabina Atzar, Head of EU Regulatory Policies at Roche. I'd like to ask the speakers to try and adhere to the times they've been given. The 3 presentations will be followed by another Q&A session. And could I request brevity on the part of the responses to the questions, please? Okay, Ivan, please.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I work at the Biostatistics Department at MSD, and I'm currently leading a key work stream at the company for implementing the EFPIA and PhRMA principles for responsible clinical trial data sharing. During this time here, I'd like to speak with you just about the MSD's progress towards commitment number 1, especially data sharing, but I'll also briefly touch on our progress today with the other 4 principles. So, from implementation standpoint, MSD currently has a process in place for data sharing since 2008. We are trying to enhance the process to bring it in line with the industry principles. And we also have a commitment sort of to collaborate with others in industry, academia, EMA, as well as the Institute of Medicine towards optimizing some of these solutions. So as shown on this slide, so obviously transparency is really important for the industry as a whole, and in MSD, transparency is a key aspect of our corporate responsibilities, and it really fosters trust. And when it goes to the clinical trial, there's a transparency focus as well. What MSD is planning to do is trying to implement different processes to be fully committed to supporting the industry principles, and will also ensure our work is consistent with our regulatory commitments. And in addition, we are also fully participating in the IOM global efforts for data transparency. In fact, many of the stakeholders that was mentioned in the previous talk that included in the IOM efforts, that include the EMA, the FDA, the patient groups, the journal editors, and academic medical centers. And IOM hosts the first meeting in October, and they plan to issue an interim report on their findings in the first quarter of next year, and plan to publish a final report by the end of next year. So the initiative really aims to developing guiding principles and a framework for responsible data sharing across all stakeholders. So this is sort of like parallel to our industry effort. Slide number 4. What it talks about is that in our MSD, we are committed to timely registration and publication of clinical trial information and disclosure of trial results. So with the clinicaltrial.gov, we start posting the information and the results since 2008, and also consider the company-sponsored clinical trials for publication. In fact, we submit the clinical protocols to journals as part of the submission of the clinical manuscript. Also adhere to the guidelines set up by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. Next slide. So what I'd like to share with you is a little bit more today is on the our experience with data sharing. So since 2008, MSD has been responding to external requests for data with an established internal process. And the whole process actually is pretty consistent with the EFPIA-PhRMA principles. For example, the requester must submit a research proposal, and the requirement for the proposal, such as a hypothesis, statistical analysis plan, and publication plan, are really consistent with the principles that are out by EFPIA and PhRMA. So each request is evaluated based on criteria that balancing the need to advance science with the need to protect privacy, confidential information, and intellectual property. As part of data sharing agreement, we really encourage and expect that the requester share the analysis results and submit them for publication. And we are aware quite a few of publication external presentation has been generated based on the data that we share. Slide 6, just to give you some idea of our recent experience, this bar graph shows the number of requests the MSD received and evaluated in the last 2 years. The majority of the requests came from investigators around the world, so this is really a global reach in terms of data requests. And the blue bar shows the total number of 57 requests that we received over the last 2 years. And to the far right, the orange bar with the 56 requests, actually 6 of them withdrawn by the requesters for a variety of reasons. Out of the 51 remaining requests, 47 have been approved, and in fact 36 has been completely processed in terms of data access sent to the third parties. And then if you look at the light blue bar, there are 3 requests that have been declined for a number of reasons. One is because of the informed consent prohibiting sharing of the data. And a second decline is due to the request asking for funding, which is out of scope of this program. And the third one is due to the complexity of the request involving a really old databases, and at the time the resources was not available to fulfill the request. So obviously, going forward, more prospectively, we would try to respond to all the requests and and trying to make our data available. If you look at it, the great majority of the requests has been fulfilled in the recent history since we established the program. Slide 7. So, as I mentioned earlier, we are aware that quite a few of our manuscripts and presentation has been generated based on the results, and some of the more notable examples here are the A to Z trials published by Oxford University in Lancet, and also another publication in Lancet and presentation in American Heart Association. So overall, we are aware about 40 manuscripts and 8 presentations since the program was established in 2008. Okay, so this comes to my last slide. So building on the program that we have now, we are trying to make enhancement to the process and bring it even more in line with the EFPIA and PhRMA principles. In general, we would like to consider developing a IT platform for more secure and controlled access to our data, and trying to look into the possibility of involving an external scientific review board in the review process. And thirdly, we're trying to develop a microsite within Merck.com to bring the process more externally. And the slides you're seeing is really a screenshot of this microsite that will be launched later this year. Currently, the site provides some educational materials for patients seeking information on MSD clinical trials. It will also have a link to study results as opposed to clinicaltrials.gov. We're also making plans to try to build this site as a placeholder when we have to allow placement for the CSR synopsis and lay summaries up for patients in the future as well.
Okay.
So with this, I'd really like to end my presentation. I'd like to thank EFPIA for the opportunity to share our experience, and thank you all for the attention.
Thank you, Ivan. If we can save questions to the end, please, we'll move on swiftly to Duncan McHale. Duncan.
Oh, hey, good evening, everyone, and thank you, EFPIA, for the opportunity to speak at the webinar. So I represent UCB. Unfortunately, I believe my slides were not comfortable with the system, so you're going to have a sort of a slide-free talk from me. But UCB, for those folks who don't know us, we're a small, mid-sized European biopharma with 2 main research sites in Brenn and Slough, with approximately 8,500 employees and approximately 3.5 million euros in sales per annum. Our core drugs are 3 new drugs, Synergy of Impact, Nupro, and then on a older set of drugs that are probably now or through patent expiry. So when it comes to the access to clinical trial data, what I've got historically is we receive actually between about 1 and 5 applications per year. So we don't receive a large number of applications. And the applications we've received in the last 4 to 5 years have all been on our new set of medications, the Synergy of Impact and Nupro that I talked about. We have a well-established process now internally that's been running for the last 2 years, where there is an internal scientific review of that proposal. It's reviewed by a scientist who is external to the project team, statistician, plus a member of the project team, to review really the sort of the scientific quality of the proposal, the suitability of the data, and a separate question which is on the value of information. We will actually approve 80% of the applications that we get, or we have done over the last 3 to 4 years. So that's our historical recent history of actual clinical trial data access. It is taken to a sort of an separate internal review process, but these are not external to UCB historically. We then look at our response to the EFPIA-PhRMA principles and how we're moving forward. We have fully signed up to those principles, and we're now moving towards the implementation. We have an internal champion identified. So these access or requests for access to clinical trial data sets we're now moving from having this internal review body to having an external review body, and that will be processed through the first half of next year. We're moving to that. We're also ensuring that our next submissions are in line with the requirements moving forward. So we will have clinical trial summaries that are suitable for patients, and they will be in place for the next set of phase 3 studies that read out for us, which will be really the end of next year and into 2015. So we are getting the right clinical trial summary data for patients that's there. We will have a new website that is up and running by the end of the first quarter or beginning of the second quarter next year. We're currently looking at some of the options on those websites. You've seen from colleagues from MSD there to have an internal website. We will have links there, but we're now looking at that we can build that website internally, or because of both resource constraints, but also for transparency, whether that might be better to use an external approach that more than one company is using. And as people know, GSK and Roche are looking at an external system like that. So we are on track for being in place the end of Q1 2014 to being executing on all of the principles that we have signed up for as the EFPIA-PhRMA principles. There are some challenges there. The challenges we are still looking at is which programs for historical data sets will we be able to include in this process. Our own history here of getting requests suggests that really it is just the CIMSI of Impact NuPro programs which we are getting requests for, and the older programs, which there's many years of clinical experience and clinical data published, we very rarely get any requests for those. We're looking at using the separate website, an external review process, potentially with other pharmaceutical companies, and we're trying to look at the resource implications for that in a minute. And finally, for us, the additional challenges and questions here is actually in 2014 making sure we have the right scientific, financial, and legal resources to be able to review these requests as they come in. As traditionally we've really just looked at it from a scientific perspective and managed the patient confidentiality, the committee confidential information side of things by providing just the data sets that are required to do the analyses. All analyses have designated statistical analysis plans. There is a commitment from the external investigators to publish all of the data so that the work that they've done is published as well. We'll now need some additional resources to actually do the legal piece as greater amounts of these data sets will become available from our programs going forwards. So we still have some outstanding questions, but we are in a strong position looking at the principles that we need to have in place for next year. And that's the sort of end of my presentation, and happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you, Duncan. Right, if we could move swiftly on to Sabina, please.
Okay. Will you upload the slides? Hello?
Hello, are the slides uploaded?
Yes, we switched them. They should be there now.
I'm afraid we can't see them.
Sabina, you have control of your slide deck. Click on the slide tab with your name.
Ah, yeah, here we go.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Thank you very much for the opportunity to present the Roche global policy on data sharing and transparency. This policy was made public in June this year, so about half a year ago, and we have spent a huge time and huge resources in translating this policy into the implementation. How to move the slides?
Click on the slide deck and use your directional keys. If that fails,
I have it. Okay, thank you very much. So the Roche policy applies to all trials conducted under Roche sponsorship around the globe. And we are convinced that making the information related to the clinical trials available enhances trust into our products, but also the way we conduct research. Nevertheless, we think certain principles need to be respected when making clinical trial data transparent. In particular, patient information needs to be protected. Legitimate commercial interests need to be protected, and this applies in particular to making results public only after a product has been authorized for marketing. And we're also we think it's important that with any transparency measures, health authorities remain the gatekeeper for drug assessment and approval, and that any system is intended to respect this gatekeeper function. Our policy applies to prospective data, but also historic data back to 1999. Now, looking at the different EFPIA-PhRMA commitments, we can confirm that we are supportive of providing access to analyzable patient-level data. Following submission of a meritorious study proposal, which will be reviewed by an independent review panel, requesters need to sign a data sharing agreement, and they need to qualify. Provisions for access to analyzable patient-level data will be effective beginning 1st of January 2014, when our systems will be fully established and the website, the access website, will be fully established. We do provide access to clinical study reports upon specific request, primarily through the health authority where a legal mandate exists. In other situations, we will present and provide access ourselves. On the summary results, I can confirm that Roche has been making summary results available to the public for all phase 2 to 4 data and phase 1 data in patients for studies back to 2002 under our own website, rochetrials.com. And when in 2014, the EMA database UTR-CT will be fully operational, we will also submit the summary results to that database in consistent with the Commission guidance. Let me look at and focus on the patient-level data access provisions. We expect the requester to fulfill certain obligations, in particular submit a formal request outlining the details of the research and an analysis plan, but also identifying themselves and providing information on any conflict of interest. We do think a data sharing agreement is necessary with a view to make sure that the agreed research is not used for commercial purposes and focuses only on the agreed principles and agreed protocols. Requesters are not allowed to download patient-level data because that would have the potential to undermine patient confidentiality. It is important that with any analysis, the requester keeps us as a company, but also the health authorities informed in case a safety issue is identified. Requesters must confirm they do not attempt to identify patients, and they should also publish the results and send a copy to Roche. Analysis will be conducted by the requesters within a secure analysis system which does not allow download of patient-level data. Requests submitted to Roche will be reviewed by an independent review panel, and the panel will decide whether a request for patient-level data should be approved, should be subject to certain conditions, or should be rejected with advice on areas to address for resubmission, or should be rejected in principle. And this information will be communicated back to Roche. The review will be performed by using what tool which is currently being set up. Anonymization is key for us to be ensured in this whole process. Therefore, we have defined certain additional elements which need to be respected. For instance, details that could help identify a patient need to be removed, such as patient initials, date of birth, hospital name, investigator name, comments fields, or admission and discharge dates. Also, there may be problems with investigator sites where less than 10 patients are enrolled. And here we think it is necessary that those patients are combined into one umbrella site as to minimize the risk of re-identification. Anonymization alone is not sufficient to maximize patient protection and confidentiality protection. Therefore, we will establish a secure analysis system which does not allow the data to be downloaded. It can only be accessed by the researchers, and requesters will have access to the system for 12 months in general. It can be prolonged in justified reasons. This system will also allow companies, requesters, to conduct cross-company analysis where the research protocol is set up to do so. Roche will not see what the requester is doing in this analysis space. We have made the information on our policy, but also the clinical trials posting available on our Roche site. And specifically for the patient-level data access, which is currently being set up, we will make publish a specific landing page in January so that all requests can be submitted to the website. Thank you very much.
Sabina, have we any questions on the telephones?
We have questions at this time, but as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1.
Okay, I'd like to ask a few questions myself in that case. The first question I'd like to pose is to Ivan. Of the 36 trials where the data processing has been completed and returned, had any feedback as to how the process was and whether what MSD delivered was in line with what was requested by the applicants?
In general, before we send, so with our current process, we actually send a data set to them. We sort of anonymize the data and work with the requester to pinpoint exactly what they need. And they usually involve maybe a couple iterations just to get agreement of exactly what variables are needed for their purpose before we send them the data.
Right.
A lot of times this is also involving collaboration with somebody at Merck to conduct researchers on this data. So there are some ongoing discussion as well. Not all of the requests have this one, but many of those I'm aware actually is sort of becoming a collaborative research effort.
Right, okay. And maybe a slightly different topic then. You discussed a little about the IOM, the Institute of Medicine. How does what the IOM is doing compare with what EFPIA-PhRMA principles are?
I think the IOM effort just starting. What they're thinking, and I attended the first workshop they held back in October, to include all the stakeholders, including the EMA, the FDA, the patient groups, the journal editors, all in one room, so to speak, and try to talk about the challenges and what will be a workable solution that can satisfy all stakeholders, and not only the United States, but also the European stakeholders, the rest of the world. So it's more a global effort trying to come up with perhaps some guiding principles on this particular topic.
Right. Do you envisage that providing data to Europe and the US will be slightly more complex than the rest of the world, or that are we coming to a kind of harmonized view of what we need?
I think, I guess the general principle would be the same regardless where the requester comes from. But there might be some local laws that would prohibit certain things to be happening or certain ways that needs to be done. But the guiding principles from a scientific point of view should be the same.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if I can move to Duncan now then. You said that 20% essentially of applications for data have not been approved by your company. Could you first comment why, and could you then perhaps say, as you move towards these EFPIA-PhRMA proposals, principles, would this 20% actually fall? Would you be giving out more data? Is that likely to be the case?
So the general reason, and we've only got a relatively small number, is that either we don't have the informed consent to do the analysis that's required, or in fact the data set per se is not available, not suitable. Sorry. So we actually haven't got the data that maybe they thought we had within the clinical trial data sets we've got. I would hope that going forward, yes, we would see fewer of those that fall at that hurdle, because what we would like to be able to do through the website as we develop the process is to give greater transparency to exactly what data is collected in some of these trials, because it's not necessarily the same that some of the investigator thinks that we have. So I would hope that we would have much greater clarity on and transparency from the website as to the sorts of questions that can be asked based on the informed consent, and also from the sorts of data that we've got collected there, so that we can have sort of a way so that investigators can see what data sets we actually have within the study. So it's usually actually a practical problem that we either don't have the right data or we can't provide it because of the informed consent under which it's been collected.
Right, okay. Going to your internal scientific review board, does this mirror what is expected within the EFPIA-PhRMA principles, or do you see some difficulties or issues transitioning towards what will be required?
So the current one, as we move from the internal to an external review board, I think the additional, I think we will be moving to what was suggested within the EFPIA principles. We will make sure we also bring in patients onto that external review board, so we have a patient voice on that with the sort of scientific and medical voices as well, and public health. So I think it will change a little bit. The external one will be in line with what is in the EFPIA principles.
Right, okay. I have a general question here. Could the companies please say how far back in time they can go for requests relating to data from historical trials before the request becomes problematic to consider, and what kinds of issues are faced with such requests?
So I can talk
Yes.
for UCB. I mean, in terms of for us, UCB was a company that was formed in the mid 2000s. The three companies it came from, well, certainly UCB had a very large number of small products, sort of over 100, a lot of which we didn't run the original data. So for us, the Cimzia, Vimpat, Nupro studies, which are our core drugs at the minute, our expectation is that we can go back to all of those studies. But as we go back to earlier studies, it's more difficult for us because they're on legacy systems from previous companies. And we don't always actually have the clinical trial data because we licensed a lot of those ones in. So for us, it's likely to be, around the 2003, 2004, but that's by dint of the fact that that's when the company came together and we've got these sets of compounds coming forwards. It's that practicality rather than the data was different prior to that.
Right, okay. Thank you, Duncan. Can I ask the same question as Sabina, please?
Yes. For Roche, I could say that our objective is to go back to 1999. And for patient-level data here, are limits to going back further related to the format in which patient-level data was analyzed. So there would be a compatibility issue if we went back further. So 1999 is the limit.
Okay, and Ivan, is that something that MSD would also like to comment on?
So with our current project, we actually don't have any limit. When we receive a request, we look at internally to see whether the data are available and how complex the request is. I know certainly we have gone back to databases in the 90s to provide data, but sometimes because it's also we involve old databases that have been the database has been changed multiple times, and sometimes it's really complicated to get to the raw data in that regard. But I think going forward, as we implement the IT platforms, what our vision is to try to make every single study going forward that with once the product is approved, it would be available for requests.
Right. Okay, thank you. Zina, if I could ask you another question, please. Roche has to have multiple mechanisms in place, not only to protect patient identity, but also to ensure that the data requester has independent use of the data. But after taking the initial understanding from the requester not to violate your terms, can you do anything further to ensure compliance? And what happens if a requester does not adhere to your terms?
Well, the data sharing agreement will be a signed agreement under private law, and I cannot predict, of course, how far a company would go in case of violation. But of course, the mechanisms which apply to violation of private contracts.
Right, okay. And another question I'd like to ask is about your independent review panel. Mm-hmm. You call it independent. My first question would be, what exactly does that mean, and how was it put together? How was it established?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Actually, we have a number of experts participating in that panel. They are external experts. And you can imagine that different experts are needed for different therapeutic areas, different research questions. So in the future, we will have to work with a pool of experts with which we enter into contracts. This is now a midterm solution. For a longer-term solution, we would look into a system where an independent review panel can be fully established as part of an independent organization. But we are on the way to reach this final objective. And the interim means we will have to sign separate contracts with the experts.
Excellent. Okay, I think we've just about run out of time, so I'd like to thank everybody for their participation and for the presenters for giving their presentations.
Whereas,
yep,
it's Brent Barnes here.
Hello, Brent.
I'd like to thank you, first of all, for the excellent moderation as well as the speakers. And I just wanted to flag up one initiative that we'll be taking in the next few days, which is obviously a cross-industry initiative like this. We're very curious to know particularly what different stakeholders plan to do when this data becomes available. So we're putting together a survey to get an overall sense of what sort of uses people will put data to and what sort of data they'll be looking for. So that will be going out later this week and possibly reporting back in January, I think, given that you have a big sort of dead time over Christmas. Regarding this event, just to say we will also be putting together a summary report of the event, which we'll be sharing with everyone who is invited or indeed who registered to participate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation today. That does conclude our conference call. You may now disconnect.